In the last lecture, I talked about the civil rights movement or movement in the streets. And what I tried to point out is that if you take a look at Dr. King's movement and you simplify it, the beginning of that movement was the Montgomery bus boycott, with Rosa Parks and Dr. King organizing a social and political protest against segregation. And it ultimately resulted in the Supreme Court intervening, striking down the bus policy in Montgomery, and Montgomery was forced to integrate the bus lines. The turning point of the movement was the Birmingham March, where Dr. King's movement and the violence of the government is broadcast nationwide, and Dr. King receives a tremendous outpouring of result, and the culmination of the movement was the Washington March for Jobs and Freedom. Dr. King gives his greatest address, his I Have a Dream speech. And unfortunately, at the end of the lecture, you have all of this good news out there. The fact that Dr. King, the President Kennedy's on board. He proposes a Civil Rights Act in the summer, in June. And then, unfortunately, a great tragedy occurs. President Kennedy is killed, and Lyndon Johnson takes over. And Lyndon Johnson is able to use his tremendous political skills. Now, President Johnson, remember I referred to him earlier as the guy that I would call the good, the bad, and the ugly, and he's all three of them. But certainly Lyndon Johnson at his best is as a civil rights president. Johnson had been a very, very effective Senate Majority Leader. Some might argue the most effective Senate Majority Leader in the history of this country. Johnson is able to get the first Civil Rights Act of the 20th century passed, a law called the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It dealt primarily with public accommodations and jobs. And keep in mind, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 looked an awful lot like the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Remember, the one that the Supreme Court declared unconstitutional in the civil rights cases of 1883. But there's a very different Supreme Court in the 1960s. As you know, this is the Warren Court. And so when this law was passed, white Southerners immediately challenged it on the basis that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is unconstitutional. The Supreme Court, all the way back in 1883, in the civil rights cases, said that private discrimination is legal or constitutional, and that if states do not want to strike down discrimination in businesses, the Congress doesn't have a right to act. In this case, the U.S. government lodges an interesting and very effective argument. I'm going to talk about two cases that I have listed in your notes. The first is the Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the U.S. The Heart of Atlanta Motel was an all-white motel. It was right off an interstate highway. And using the Commerce Clause, which I've talked about many times in this course, in Article 1, Section 8, the argument was that the Heart of Atlanta Motel is a business that's involved in interstate commerce. It is an artery of interstate commerce, an interstate highway that supplies this motel with its customers. If you look at the registration book from the motel, they have served customers from virtually every state in this country. And so they are agents of interstate commerce, and the Supreme Court upheld the Civil Rights Act of 1964, ruling that they were, in essence, just enforcing their commerce powers. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was upheld. The significance of this case, in the second case I'm going to talk about, Katzenbach versus McClung, is that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was upheld in both these cases. that the precedent of the civil rights cases of 1883 was dead, and that now legally the Supreme Court had gutted both of those pillars of Jim Crow. Let me just say a few words about Katzenbach versus McClung. Mr. McClung was the owner of a barbecue pit, a restaurant. And the argument that was raised on behalf of Mr. McClung is that, unlike the motel, he wasn't involved in interstate commerce, that the customers he served were local, and that he was far from an interstate highway. The Warren Court took a very expansive, and some would say a controversial view of Article 1, Section 8, because Warren said in this case that while it is true that the customers being served are locals, the food being served, the truckers who keep this restaurant in business, the very building materials that make up this restaurant, were all agents of interstate commerce. So what should you know about this? Well, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and these two Supreme Court cases finally eliminate that second vestige of Jim Crow. Think back a couple of lectures ago, I told you that there were thousands of Jim Crow laws, but that they rested on two fundamental pillars. The first was the civil rights cases of 1883, which in essence allowed private discrimination in businesses. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and these two Supreme Court cases overturned that 81 years later. The second and the more famous pillar was in Plessy versus Ferguson, that established the so-called separate but equal doctrine, and that was overturned in the last lecture in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. So now as a legal principle, segregation is dead. But that second pillar of Jim Crow, political neutralization, was still there. There still was discrimination and hassling and intimidation in voting. And so the second prominent Civil Rights Act that was passed was a law called the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And what I want you to know about the Civil Rights Act of 1965 is that the number of black voters increased dramatically. For example, if you take a look at black voter registration in the state of Mississippi, it increased 900% from just the years 1965 to 1970. In the early 1970s, for the first time in a century, we begin seeing black locally elected leaders in the southern part of our country. And so you have a prominent Civil Rights Act in 64. You have a Voting Rights Act in 1965. I didn't include this in your notes, but there also is a very prominent Civil Rights Act passed in 1968 banning discrimination in housing. That act was less successful. Housing continues to be highly segregated in America, even to this day, although certainly far less so than half a century ago. But segregation continues in housing, largely for those non-legal factors, those de facto realities, differences in income and settlement patterns, and still some racial attitudes. The Civil Rights Acts were coupled with a more controversial policy called affirmative action. Critics quickly labeled affirmative action reverse discrimination. In the boundary line between what is legitimate affirmative action and what constitutes reverse discrimination is controversial to this day. Affirmative action began during the Johnson administration in federal contracting. But personally, when I think about affirmative action, given what I do for a living, I think about university admissions. My old school, the University of California at Davis, had the most famous affirmative action case in American history. In the notes, it points out in the 1978 case of UC Regents versus Bakke, the Supreme Court ruled that rigid racial quotas are illegal. However, universities can use race, and I left that word out, can use race as a factor in admissions. And let me give you the background of this case a little bit. UC Davis's medical school was founded in 1965 by Dr. Tupper. And when the school was first founded, the top 100 students got in regardless of race. The criteria to get into UC Davis's medical school was grade point average, the medical school admission test, and an interview. Dr. Tupper noticed that the medical school was overwhelmingly white and Asian, and as a result, he changed the admissions policy to a two-track policy. 84 slots would still have the traditional criteria of GPA, MCAT, and interview. But 16 of the slots he reserved for what he called traditionally disadvantaged groups, which in this case would be Black, Hispanic, and Native American students. Alan Bakke missed admission to the medical school by 2 points. And somehow he was tipped off that all 16 of the people who had gotten into the medical school based on the reserved category had scores less than his. So Alan Bakke sued, saying that he was the victim of a race-based quota system. The court was really split into three factions. 4 of the justices said that UC Davis was trying to do the right thing, that diversity is a socially compelling goal, and that Davis should be allowed to do this, at least for the foreseeable future. 4 of the justices believed that Alan Bakke was the victim of reverse discrimination and that he should be admitted to the medical school immediately. And so that left the 9th justice, Justice Powell, and Justice Powell believed that both sides had legitimate arguments, that both sides should win. And so what Powell said in this case is that he did believe that diversity was a socially compelling goal. He agreed with Davis. And that's why, according to Powell, universities should be allowed to use race as a factor in admissions. However, Powell also believed that Alan Bakke was the victim of reverse discrimination and that Bakke should be admitted to the school. So that's what happened. Alan Bakke was admitted to the school. He did graduate. He became an anesthesiologist in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, and so it worked out for him. Now, I listed 2 other cases because we only had one justice, Justice Powell, who believed in this notion that race should be a factor but not the decisive factor in admissions. The experts predicted that the Bakke precedent would only last 5 years, maybe less. Well, 25 years went by, and we have 2 cases from another school I attended, the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And in this particular case, all I want you to know about the cases of Gratz and Grutter versus Bollinger is that they upheld the Bakke precedent. In Gratz versus Bollinger, the Supreme Court struck down the freshman admissions policy. The Supreme Court said that race was so decisive a factor in the University of Michigan's freshman admissions policy that it resembled a racial quota that was prohibited in Bakke. However, in the second case, Grutter versus Bollinger, the Supreme Court upheld the University of Michigan Law School admissions policy, saying that applicants were treated as individuals, that race was a minimal factor in admissions, and that the University of Michigan need not exhaust every race-neutral policy in addressing a remedy. The court also reinforced the notion that diversity is a socially compelling goal and is a legal means of remedy.